Hey folks, so in this video, I want to talk a little bit about graphical user interfaces. So this is what we're kind of all familiar with, right? Whenever we use a computer these days or electronic device in general, we're typically using a GUI interface, or we're typically using it from a graphical perspective. Text-based interfaces aren't really that common anymore. So I have two examples up here. One is Windows, the other is iOS. So you can see my Windows example, which is a little bit meta here. I have a picture of PowerPoint, which was being used to create the previous slide that I was talking through. On the right-hand side, I just have a generic iOS picture, right? So both of these are graphical user interfaces. But they're graphical user interfaces kind of for different contexts. Obviously, the one on the left is for a computer, right? Something where I have a keyboard and a mouse. Versus on the right, it's for a touchscreen device, right? So I can have kind of different inputs, but kind of the same system being used. The purpose of a graphical interface is to be something that's more intuitive for us to use, right? So a text-based interface maybe isn't all that intuitive, right? I mean, typing dir, typing cd, you would maybe have to memorize those things. Right? How can I make a system more accessible to somebody? I can make it more accessible to somebody by using different metaphors, right? So the idea of a metaphor, right, in user design is I want to give the user something that they have some sort of familiarity with, right? So here we use something called the desktop metaphor. So here I'm going to go to my desktop on this computer here. I have maybe something that's akin to the top of a table, right? So if I was sitting in front of a table, I'd have different objects on it, right? And I can interact with them, right? So here, right, it's kind of the same thing. So I can look over here and I can basically say, oh, there is this file, right? I can go and I can view this, or I can click this, or I can open whatever, right? I don't really want to open stuff here because these aren't my files. But the point is, right, is this is maybe familiar to you, right? You think of, I'm sitting in front of a desk, there's different objects on this desk, I can interact with those different objects. Same thing is happening here. I'm sitting in front of a desk, right, which is an area where there could be stuff, and I can go and interact with the different objects they're sitting on, right? Actually, I'll do one thing, right? So I can do things like, for example, create something, right? Maybe I can open this up, right? This is me, on my desk, right? Open up, a book that I've written or something like that, or that I've bought, that type of deal. So the idea, right, is that a desktop on a computer can maybe be similar to a real desktop, because then you have your intuition of different objects and interacting with those different objects. So you kind of borrow that, right? And if you have a metaphor for these things, right? So if you're using a metaphor, it's basically easier for people to take their intuition from something that exists and apply it to your new thing, okay? So this is the fundamental idea behind a GUI, right? Between a graphical interface is leveraging your intuition through use of a metaphor. All right, so you have kind of these notions here of, for example, icons and folders. So an icon, right, is these things over here, right? This is an icon, right? Some of them represent files, some represent folders. They represent things they can interact with. Some of them are a little bit special, some of them are folders, right? So this is over here just a file, right? So this is a recording from some other session. Actually, that might be this session. Yeah, I think that's this session right now. Versus over here, right, this is a folder. Folder is something I can open up, and there maybe is different files inside, right? So that's kind of two different things there, right? I can have either one thing by itself, right, a file, or I can have many things together in some sort of a folder. Note that folder is basically going to be kind of a conceptual name, right? So a folder is basically a container. There are many things in it. There's also another term which you hear from time to time, which is directory. Directory is a little bit different. Directory is referring to how the specific file system is storing your data, right? So you have this directory, this directory, this directory, versus folders are more kind of conceptual. You can somehow underneath, for example, do things like have, like you can have, for example, two icons of two different folders, and they both lead to the same set of files. So they're both kind of redirects to the same place, okay? That's called basically a symbolic link, right? You're linking from one place to another. Rather than having copies of the file in two places, you can have two folders that link to the same location. Now, under the hood, in terms of your operating system, it'll be like, oh, there's only one directory, right? There's only one real place the stuff is being stored, but I have two icons that lead to the same place, right? So icons, right, or folders, right, tend to be more kind of conceptual, and then there's a file system behind the scenes which actually works on, delivering the contents to you. All right, so the typical input device for this type of interface, right, is going to be a mouse. So that's what I've been using right now, right? I have a nice mouse here, which I think they replaced over break because it's completely unfamiliar, and it doesn't even have a brand on it, which is a little bit suspicious. But I'm using a mouse, right? I can move it around, right? There's a little laser pointer on it. I can click left and right. I can scroll. I can do all sorts of things. Typical input device. I can also have an input device in terms of touch, right? So you have a touchscreen phone, right? A touchscreen computer, right? Basically, I could go and tap stuff here. And I have my pen here, but I'm not going to demo a touch-based interface. So I can have different ways, right, to interact with this, right? So I can imagine using my mouse to click on a file. I can imagine using my finger to tap on a file, right? Both ways kind of indicate that I'm interested in using it and seeing what goes on. If I have a touch device, I can also have things like gestures, right? So you can imagine that I can have, I can draw an X, right? Maybe that represents me deleting a file, or a check mark means save. I don't know. You can have different kind of things as well. All right. So those are kind of two basic ways to interact with these graphical interfaces. Before I go on, I have a question for you guys, which is there at the very end. So how does pointer input and touch input differ? So take 1 second and just think to yourself, what maybe are the differences between using a mouse to interact with something and maybe just using like a finger to interact with something? What are maybe the differences there? All right, so one of the biggest differences is simply the fact that you can't really like lift your mouse, right? So if I have a mouse, right, I basically am always active, right? I can kind of navigate around and I can do whatever. I can never actually remove that cursor, right? Now, if I was using a touch-based interface, I could, right? I can actually lift my finger away from the interface, right, to do stuff. I can basically, I wish I could show you guys me looking at the interface here, but it's like, you can imagine, right, I click on something, right, I can lift my hand, my cursor disappears from the screen, I put it down and it appears somewhere else, right? That's actually a big difference, right? And if you go and look at interface, right, that's actually a big thing because, so for example, drag support, right? So I want to click drag, right, to select things. That's hard to do, right? Because I have basically this notion of I can move a mouse cursor around and then I can click on it to say, oh, this is active. There's two different states, right? Either just it's there or it's there and it's active, right? Whereas for a touch-based interface, it's always active, right? If it's there, it's active, right? So I can't do click and drag, right, in a touch-based interface like I can with a mouse because once when I select, right, it's just going to always be clicked. And I guess click and drag you could implement, but again, there's this idea there that your cursor is not always active if you have a touch-based interface, whereas you are if there's a mouse-based interface. All right, and there's other differences as well. One that I kind of have there hinted at, right, is multi-touch, right? We sometimes have devices where it's like, well, if I touch these two places, I can do zoom or whatever. We don't have that with a mouse, right? So anyways, and there are other differences as well. I won't go into them right now. All right, to wrap up our discussion of kind of interfaces, I want to talk about basically command line versus GUI. So here's a question for you guys to think about, and then I'll discuss. Why would we want to use a command line interface instead of a GUI interface? What would be the advantages of it? So take 1 second and think about that. So one advantage, so there's a couple of advantages that occur to me, and obviously there are going to be more as well. The first one basically is performance, right? So if I have a system, right, with a huge graphical interface, that's basically another program running. It's going to slow me down, right? I need to basically dedicate CPU time, memory time to having this whole other interface open, right? And this can be problematic, right? For example, when I want to do something like remotely control a computer, right? So if I want to remote into a computer that uses a GUI interface, it's going to have to send me basically pictures of its desktop. It's going to be really slow. It's going to be really laggy. Versus if I have a command line interface, it's just sending across text, right? That'll be a lot faster, right? So one thing, right, is that command line interface is definitely going to be more efficient. It's going to be more efficient using it directly. It's going to be more efficient using it remotely. Another reason why we want to use a command line interface is because we have more options. Somehow in a GUI, there's this sense that you can only do the options that are listed on your screen. And the options listed on your screen are going to be a finite number of options. They're just the ones that the user designer decided to show to you. For a command line interface, you can type in all sorts of things, right? So you can type in, a command, right? And this command can be complex. It can be something dash something dash something dash something, whatever, right? You can give more options, right? So it's basically a way to, basically a command line interface, because it doesn't, limit you to selecting from a menu, right? Basically, there's all these different commands I can input, right? I can do whatever I want. So it gives me a lot more flexibility, a lot more power. All right, second bullet point there. Why use a GUI instead of a command line interface, right? So this is the other way around. So take 1 second and think about that. So the main reason, right, the reason we do use them is simply intuition, right? It's simply a lot easier to use a GUI than a command line interface. The fact that it uses a desktop metaphor means that people, right, that don't even know much about how a computer works can still use a desktop successfully, right? They have this idea of this is how I structure things, this is how I interact with things. It's all there for me, I don't need to think about, what commands am I supposed to be typing into this little text-based interface, right? So it's more intuitive. Another advantage of using a GUI is that you have basically better access to things like more information, right? Or doing things in parallel, right? So imagine you're editing an image. Do you really want to do that from a command line interface? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? You want to have that whole picture there. You want to see the colors. You want to see all that information, right? So if you have a lot of information, probably a GUI is going to be better, right? So that would be the kind of a second area I would say maybe a GUI is important, right? Is you have a lot of information in one go, a lot of information being displayed, right? There's less information right in a command line prompt window than your actual desktop. Or you want to have basically multiple things running, right? I mean, you can have multiple things running in a command-based interface, but somehow, right, a GUI maybe is a little bit more natural, right? You can communicate between things, you can see things at the same time a little bit easier than doing a command line interface, okay? So that would be the second thing I would see as an advantage. All right, so hopefully this set of videos is giving you guys a little bit of some more things to think about with respect to command line interfaces, with respect to GUIs, right? And some sense about how, one is good sometimes versus the other is good other times. All right, so that's all I got for this video. I will see you guys in the next video.